a definite shape, perspective, vision, and mission to make it an institute known as Advocacy, Research, and Training Center. Father Stan Swamy succeeded him. Under the guidance of Father Stan, the staff of ISI inspired, motivated, and trained thousands of men and women, priests and religious, on social analysis, using scientific tools of analysis, adhering to the spirit of pedagogy of the oppressed. At the beginning of this millennium, Father Stan set up Bagecha, a research and training center in Nankum, Ranchi. He campaigned and advocated for better implementation of the 5th schedule of the Constitution. Falsely implicated in the Bhima Koregaon case, Father Stan died as an under-trial prisoner on 5th of July 2021. Drawing inspiration from these two stalwarts, the Institute continues its journey with the marginalized communities, especially in accompanying the Dalits, the Adivasis, women, children, and migrants in southern India, upholding human rights of those whose rights are neglected and violated with a mission of reconciliation and justice. On this day, we remember what Father Volken had said. We cannot teach the poor how to live, rather we learn from them how to live. Amidst all the challenges and violations, Father Stan said, I am not a silent spectator. As we talk about democracy and human rights, we remember human rights defenders, activists, journalists who are being falsely implicated and put behind the bars. Isn't it true that democracy is dying each day in our country and voices of dissent are being throttled? In this context, the 11th Memorial Lecture on Democracy and Human Rights Defenders assumes significance. I invite you to actively participate in this memorial lecture as we listen and interact with senior advocates Brinda Grover and Henry Tiffin. Let us now begin today's event by watching a video.
The last book that I would like to mention is the establishment of this institution called the ISI. He generated the spirit of tribal philosophy, of simplicity, hospitality, and ancestral heritage in this history. We see particularly in which the names of the movements have been written. Here we are sitting in a place called Akara, where people can sit and make decisions concerning their community. I think it's very important that this place is here for the activists, for the human rights workers, who can come and reflect over the issues that are affecting the ordinary people.
Now we will have a prayer song by ISI staff and SMI sisters. Let us all stand up.
Sheets. bend my knees before insolent might. This is my prayer to thee, my Lord. Strike, strike at the root of penury in my heart. Give me the strength to raise my mind high above daily trifles. Give me the strength to surrender my strength to thy will with love. This is my prayer to thee, my Lord. Strike, strike at the root of penury in my heart.
I now invite the dignitaries to the dais. I request Archbishop Reverend Peter Machado, Advocate Brinda Grover, Advocate Henry Tiffin, and Dr. Joseph Xavier to pay tribute with flowers to Father Volken and Father Stan, and water the plant as a sign of taking their legacy forward. I invite Mr. Shujayatullah, Facilitator of Programs of Karnataka Social Inclusion Democracy Unit, to welcome everyone.
Good evening and warm welcome to each and every one of you to Volken Stan Swamy Memorial Lecture 2022. This institute has been organizing for the Henry Volken Annual Memorial Lectures. However, this year the institute decided to change it to Volken Stan Swamy Memorial Lecture. These two stalwarts laid foundation for this institute. Some of us would remember Father Henry Volken, but many of us know Stan Swamy as he spent 6 months in this institute in 2019. When we approached Senior Advocate of the Supreme Court, Ms. Brinda Grover, to deliver this year's memorial lecture on democracy and human rights defenders, she gladly accepted our invitation. On behalf of Institute and all of us, I warmly welcome you, ma'am. We have another important person amidst us, Mr. Henry Tiffin, who is a good friend of Father Stan Swamy. In fact, Mr. Henry and our director, Father Joseph Xavier, accompanied Father Stan till the end. We are privileged to have you, sir, to be the chairperson for this lecture. A warm welcome to you, sir. We have amidst us friends from civil society, human rights organizations, students, teachers, advocates, priests and religious, friends from media, partners, well-wishers of Father Stan, and also the Institute. On behalf of the Institute, I welcome you all. Thank you. Have a pleasant evening.
Now I request Father Francis Balraj, convener of the organizing committee of this lecture, and Miss Farida to honor Advocate Brinda Grover. I request Father Shiju Matthew, the administrator, and Miss Roshni to honor Advocate Henry Tiffin. I now invite Father Joseph Xavier to set the context of today's memorial lecture.
Good evening, Namaskar, Shubha Sanjay, Malai Vanakkam. Dear friends, a hearty welcome to you for the 11th Volken Stan Swamy Memorial Lecture. I am grateful to you for taking off time from your schedule to be with us to celebrate the life of Volken and Stan Swamy and the legacy they have left for the Institute and for all of us. On behalf of the Institute, I would like to once again extend a warm welcome to our senior advocate Brinda Grover, who will deliver the lecture, and Mr. Henry Tiffin, who would chair the proceedings and moderate the session. A warm welcome to both of you. It is always a joy to have you, dear friends, amidst us. By your presence, you demonstrate how much you love Indian Social Institute and its mission. Hearty welcome to each one of you. It is my privilege to share with you why Volken and Stan Swamy are so fondly remembered by this institute. To me, the memories are not just a narrative of Indian Social Institute, Bangalore. Their life narratives are part of the dignified human development processes of the marginalized and struggles of the human rights defenders. Just after the independence of our country, the Jesuits thought that beyond engaging in formal educational services, it was imperative to contribute to nation building from socio-political and developmental perspectives, especially from the perspectives of the marginalized. This thinking paved way for establishing Indian Social Institute in Pune in 1951. Later in 1961, considering the political exigency, the Jesuits decided to move the institute to Delhi so that the works of the institute could influence the policymakers. At that point of time, the Jesuits felt the necessity to have a presence in South, and Bangalore was considered as the right place to reach out to the marginalized communities of South Indian states. In 1948, just after independence, Volken left his homeland and came to India as a missionary. In 1963, he was appointed as the first director of Indian Social Institute, Bangalore. For the Volken was a thinker beyond his lifetime, as many of you would have noticed. Volken took community development as the content of training at ISI. Later, realizing the importance of addressing structural injustices and inequalities, he introduced social analysis as a theme and content of the training programs. As the head of this institute for 12 years, he gave a definitive perspective and orientation to make it nationally and internationally known as Training, Research and Knowledge Development Center. He also started Mobile Training Team, popularly those days known as MOT. In 1975, Volken handpicked Stan Swamy to succeed him as he moved to Rome to work at the global level with the Jesuits. Stan, along with Duarte, and is here, and other staff members, continued to anchor social analysis, animation, and organizing the marginalized as the key orientations of this institute. Later, Stan moved to Chaibasa to realize his original passion to be with the Adivasis. In 2006, Stan founded Bagaicha in Ranchi and continued to be at the service of the Adivasis in the Chota Nagpur area. He was falsely implicated in Bhima Goregaon case, a place which he has not seen in his lifetime, and died on 5th July 2021 as under trial prisoner. As many civil and human rights activists said, Stan's death was an institutional murder. Stan served this institute for 16 long years and was the director of this institute for 11 years. He ensured that the institute was solidly grounded in the struggles of the poor. During his time, hundreds of social activists were trained by the institute. I'm sure some of you are here. Many of you initiated civil society organizations and human rights organizations to contribute to social transformation. The two stalwarts had a lot of similarities. Father Volken said, and I quote, "I believe that within a comprehensive perspective of human rights, we can best make the contribution to a transformation that makes human development possible and reverses the present trend of increasingly dividing the humanity into rich and poor across the world, destroying the resources of the planet and fostering a culture of violence." On 8 October 2020, just before his arrest, Stan reiterated, "I am not a silent spectator." Later, from the prison, he wrote, "May truth embolden us to speak truth to power and be ready to pay the price." The first death anniversary of Stan and remembrance of Volken are moments of celebration. Henry Tiffan and I had the opportunity to walk with Stan for many years. In July 2019, Stan landed in Bangalore in this institute and stayed for 6 months. Many of us during that time had interacted with him. Just before his arrest, Stan asked me to come to Bagaicha, and I was there with him for 3 days in the beginning of October. That was my last meeting with him face to face. I found him composed, calm, strong in mind and heart. It is this same spirit he demonstrated in Taloja prison. Compassion, conviction, and a deep faith in the power of the ordinary people. Personally, I am grappling with my last conversation with Stan. On 28th June 2021, realizing that his end is near, from the hospital bed he said, "Take forward the struggles of the Adivasis for dignified life." Take forward the struggles of the Adivasis for dignified life. Stan believed that one day the Adivasis will live with dignity, and this is the legacy he wanted to pass on. We celebrate today Volken and Stan's deep faith in humanity and in all of us. Though Stan is not with us, the Society of Jesus continues to journey with the remaining 15 co-accused in Bhima Goregaon case and their family members. 13 of them are still languishing in prison without bail for more than 4 years. We also specially remember today number of human rights defenders from Kashmir, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh and other states of India, especially Teesta Setalvad, who has been a close associate of this institute. She was a great support to me when Stan was in prison. Yesterday, we also heard the news that the Enforcement Directorate has imposed 50 crore rupees on Amnesty International and 10 crores on our friend Akar Patel. All these incidents indicate demonstration of ruthlessness of the state to crush the voice of those who demand justice. We need more human rights defenders today to build India as a vibrant democracy. To help us to delve deeper on this subject, we have with us Advocate Vrinda Grover and Henry Tiffin, who are the forefront human rights defenders today in India. I am grateful to them. Many of us know Henry, and he does not require a formal introduction. His thinking and commitment for social change is as tall and as vibrant he is. From the time of ICAF, when he joined the students' movement at a very young age, he never stepped back despite many challenges. From 2019, both of us have been working closely with Stan. The journey was not easy, especially when NIA began their inquiry in July 2020. Practically every day we were talking with Stan and Father Solomon, who was in Bagacha at that time, in solidarity and companionship. Stan will pose critical questions from high moral ground and ask us, what are you saying, Henry? What are you saying, Joe? We will look at each other. For many of those questions, we didn't have an answer. For human rights defenders, life is not black and white. Often it will be gray. However, with deep faith in humanity, Stan was able to see the light at the end of the tunnel, which kept him going outside and inside the Taloja prison. I would say Henry and I have learned a lot of lessons for life from Stan. Henry also has fond memories of Volken, as Volken has been the chaplain of Henry's mother. Henry, we are privileged to have you amidst us. As I conclude, I would like to once again welcome all of you and thank you for your presence to celebrate the lives of Volken and Stan to take forward their legacies. May I now request Mr. Henry to say a few words as opening remarks, introduce the speaker of the day, Advocate Vrinda Grover, and take over the proceedings. Henry will give us his concluding remarks at the end. Thank you all and have a wonderful time.
Archbishop Joe, Vrinda, and friends gathered here. These are supposed to be opening remarks, and these are supposed to be more than the opening remarks, introducing Vrinda in a manner that we get inspired and in a manner that we assure her we follow her footsteps. For me, it is an honor to chair this memorial lecture of two people, in the name of two people, both of whom I have known at different parts of my life. Father Henry Volken was, as said by Father Joe Xavier, a chaplain of my mother's group of friends who called themselves IFI those days and used to love coming to Bangalore, one of whom is still alive in India, Nalini Naik being one of their team. And for me, coming here was a good holiday, because then I had no control and I could play in this old campus of ISI, which many of you may not remember, but the Bangalore people will definitely remember the old cottages of the ISI. Stan, of course, different parts of my life, I have interacted with him personally, when I was a college student, later when I was in Vallipatti in Dindigul, later as a law student, then of course in my early years of practice as a lawyer. But what is most important for me is the last journey that Joe spoke of. We were all privileged to be part of that last journey. And the last call was on the same day when both Cynthia and myself spoke to him through a clandestine call that Father Fraser was able to link us on the 28th of June. That was the last conversation. And when we asked him how he was, he said, "They are teaching me how to walk, Henry. And they are telling me I can't go back to Ranchi. I have to get cured here." These were the last words he said. In Madurai, when he was there, I had the privilege of having him at home, or we were privileged of having him at home for quite some time, till we thought, when the warrant was issued in the Jharkhand court, that being with somebody else like me at home was not safe for him any longer. So he moved to another Jesuit house, but then started those questions. He had to meet me every 2 days because he had a list of questions. And those questions had to be answered. Sometimes long periods of silence were answers, but questions had to be answered. You can't stand in front of Stan without answering questions. I specifically want to pay tributes to Father Joe Xavier, the present director here, for the very serious accompanying he did on behalf of the Jesuits of this country, right from the time that we are speaking about, but even after that, after his death, for all what took place later. Thank you, Joe, and this thanks come from all of us here. It was a very special accompanying that you did, and for me it was extremely edifying being party to it and watching it from very, very close quarters. And I think it is time also to proudly praise the Jesuits of this country for saying, with Stan, our journey is not over, and taking the resolve at the national level that they will be accompanying the BK16 family throughout in their legal journey, and in particular authorizing their lawyer Mihir to challenge it legally in the in the Bombay High Court, challenging the institutional murder that has taken place. All of us are upset that the case is not coming up for hearing, but the fact that you have a congregation which has determined to fight it till the end, I think that needs a big applause from all of us here, because that is what is lacking usually. That is what is usually lacking in the institutional church, but here is a difference which we are really appreciative of. Vrinda also doesn't need introduction. But Vrinda needs introduction for some reason. Not to say how great she is, not to say what a good lawyer she is, but for all of us to realize that to develop such a mettle within her as a lawyer, as a women's rights activist, as a human rights activist, as a researcher, there has been a long preparation that she has undertaken. The listing out of responsibilities that she has held will not suffice to just recall. But what is most important is that we have in our midst somebody associated with a variety of important cases by directly intervening in those cases, right from the 1984 anti-Sikh riots up till a few days ago with the arrest, custody of Dubai. Throughout this period, she has done a variety of matters in court, and the combination of not only wanting to do matters in the Supreme Court, not wanting to do matters only in the High Court, but willing to go and dirty her hands in the trial courts is her special character, which we, I think, we remember now. There are lawyers and lawyers who would prefer positions of arguing matters in the High Courts and the Supreme Courts. But there are very few lawyers who are willing to do the most difficult work, which is defending people whose rights have been violated right at the trial courts, both prosecuting and defending people. And that is something which is very, very strong in her. She prepared herself. She prepared herself intellectually. She prepared herself professionally. And today, I am proud to say that a very close friend of mine is the chairperson of the International Service for Human Rights, which actually is one of the most reputed international human rights organizations working in Geneva and based in New York. She is the chair of their board at the moment, which I think is something of a repute to all of us Indians. She has had the privilege of also drafting several laws. And drafting several laws is not a peaceful journey. I've seen her in the midst of some of those journeys and fights that have to take place in civil society with words that have to be in and words that have to be out. And it's not an easy journey. Whether it is the criminal law, amendment to the law against sexual assault, or POCSO, or the protection of prevention of torture bill in 2013, in any legislation, she was there also as a drafter of different legislations. In 2013, and this, she's not going to be very happy, but this has to be told, she was selected as one of the 100 most influential people in the world by the Time magazine. I know what that smile says. Friends, a very warm friend. A warm friend doesn't mean we have peaceful coexistence. A warm friend is somebody who's willing to criticize you at any point of life and at the same time stand with you in solidarity at any point of life. That has been our very, very strong relationship with Vrinda. Vrinda is a good friend because Vrinda is a good critique equally of you. She's had several memorial awards, grants to do research and come out with books, etc. But all that ultimately today has been at the service of a variety of people who need her. Individuals, institutions, women, victims of child violence, victims of sexual violence, you name it, she is there for you. Vrinda, there could not have been a better person than you for this lecture. And I don't want to stop only introducing you, but hope that many of us gathered here will prepare ourselves for the dark days ahead and get inspiration from you and the lecture today. Thank you.
After Henry, the standard always has to be lowered. Thank you, Father Joe. Thank you, ISI, for this privilege, and it is indeed a privilege to be invited to speak at the Father Stan Swamy Memorial Lecture. There is very high praise coming from my very dear friend Henry, and I think when he was listing various things, it's actually more a reminder of one's age than anything else. It's not necessarily a function of one's achievements. It's about having been around for long. I also want to say that when I heard Father Joe speak, what Henry has said, today for an institution, for ISI, for Jesuits, to stand up and say that they are going to stand on the side of the peoples of this country. They are going to stand on the side of human rights. He spoke about Kashmir, Chhattisgarh, Jharkhand. There are many people who would bite their tongue before even mentioning the names of these states in this country. I have known Indian Social Institute in Delhi. All of them have always been friends in solidarity through all struggles. And it is very important that ISI and the Jesuits have taken a call to side with truth and justice at this difficult moment. Henry spoke of the dark times. Brecht said, will there be singing in the dark times? Yes, there will be singing of the dark times. I don't have a prepared lecture today. I would have wanted to have one. But the events of last week have been all-consuming. As a resident of this city, who I think the city would be proud of, Muhammad Zubair, has been embroiled, entangled, and his personal liberty constrained, which has compelled me to be involved in first securing his liberty as the state tries to embroil him and implicate him further and further. I also don't have a written lecture because I think we are at a moment where we need to think and revisit many paradigms, many understandings, many insights that we perhaps had. I engage with the law, and for me, what is the law? What does the law do? These times compel me to revisit much that I had thought of and understood. I have now been in legal practice for a little over 30 years. I went into law primarily because of my interactions with the women's movement, and I see here in the audience many friends from the feminist movement, from the human rights movement, from the RTI movement who have joined. So it is more a conversation that I would like to have with you, and definitely not a lecture. I went into law through my university level interactions with the women's movement, feminist street theatre that I was part of, and trade union movement, thinking of law as a means perhaps through which we could secure some rights. This was the early 80s, the mid 80s. Today I am interrogating much of what I have learned and understood. And I think somewhere thinking about Father Stan helps me revisit that where perhaps in our thinking we could not see clearly that our interrogations were insufficient. I knew Father Stan Swamy personally, of course not as closely and as intimately as Father Joe and Henry have had the privilege of. I have met him in Ranchi when I had gone to speak about the use of RTI to get information from prisons, etc. I had done a research with a group of which was largely enabled by the Jagdalpur Legal Aid Group, which was at that time working in Chhattisgarh. They are no longer working there, largely because of the manner in which the state has been rather intimidatory towards them. And the research that I did was looking at the role of prisons in a state where there is conflict. And of course there is conflict in the Bastar, South Chhattisgarh region. And I was looking at the criminal courts, I was looking at prisons, and I was using a lot of RTI material. And my research showed that prisons had become holding spaces where Adivasis were kept for long periods of time. And when I visited the courts, and I also went and argued for Soni Sodi and Linga in Dantewada court in a case that earlier this year they finally got acquitted, as most cases do end, because we know that the purpose is something else. If you spoke to the Adivasis who were incarcerated or their families, they all said, we are in a Naxal case. Of course, there is no such offense in the Indian Penal Code, but they were all rounded up largely in areas where extractive industries or other companies, private or public, wanted natural resources. And large number of Adivasis were. And at one point, the NCRB data showed that Chhattisgarh had the highest under trial population. This was acknowledged by the state, and they tried to set up committees to discharge some of them because they were dying. These were Adivasis who were very often malnutrition, in extreme penury. That is what Father Stan was doing. He was documenting for Jharkhand what was happening to the Adivasis, why were they incarcerated, why were they in jail, what was the case against them, why was the case not concluding, why were they in prison for 7 years, 8 years, 9 years. Somebody was selling land patta to get bail, somebody was selling land, giving land titles to the lawyers, some were dying in jail. He was documenting this. And after documenting it, he filed a writ petition in the Jharkhand High Court. Stan wrote an email to me saying, you come and argue this matter for me in Ranchi High Court. I of course readily agreed. I thought it was a privilege that Stan thought I could do some justice to the work that he had documented meticulously. His data was primarily from the district of Chaibasa. He had documented it as to what were the reasons, who were they, why were they not being enlarged, and the High Court actually issued notice on it and asked the state to respond. The state, as we know, has many cards up its sleeve. Delay, protracting, not answering, evasive, fudging, everything in the name of the state is allowed. Try it as an ordinary citizen and you will be pulled up by the court and everybody else. That petition did not move very much further because the state and the court kept asking them to give detailed replies to the district-wise data that Stan had documented. And the state was running away from answering those questions because they were very difficult questions. And it seems Stan asked everybody difficult questions, including the state. And then they started, from June 2018, what is called the Bhima Koregaon case, when the raids took place in June and again in August on many human rights defenders across the country. And of course the case then slipped away because there were many concerns that engulfed him. But perhaps that gives us a clue. What was he doing that was so dangerous? What was the questions that he was asking that were so dangerous? He was asking, why are the most poor, impoverished in prison? What is the offense they have committed, and why is their liberty curtailed by the state? And Why are these cases mushrooming constantly? It is actually a contestation of ideas that we are in, and nothing is more dangerous in the world than an idea. It is not any form of weaponry. It is an idea that the state finds extremely threatening. And perhaps the state had also sensed Stan's stubbornness and determination to not give up on what he could see quite clearly. And we know that all the people who are in the Bhima Koregaon case, Sudha Bharadwaj, again a very, very close friend, they were, unlike many of us, actually organizing on the ground, working directly with the peoples, which is not only way more difficult and requires a completely different level of commitment, but also has within it the seeds of change. The one community in India that perhaps has interacted voluntarily and on its own least with the legal system, if I'm not wrong, are the Adivasis. In fact, in legal jargon it is called that for Adivasis there is a docket exclusion, whereas for everybody else, and we know the areas under which all courts are literally crumbling, from the Supreme Court to high courts to trial courts, we call it a docket explosion. The Adivasis are in court when they are brought, they are entangled by the law and brought to court. They do not go to court voluntarily seeking rights or seeking justice. In fact, the Ministry of Tribal Affairs last report of 2014, before the government changed, they did a documentation of looking at the legal system and Adivasis, and came to this conclusion that Adivasis are brought to court. They don't come to court. And when I say perhaps, when I revisit for myself the whole business of law, and it is a business, perhaps we need to learn from the Adivasi community their hesitation, their reluctance in sensing what is this legal structure and how the power and the writ of the state will run from top to bottom, which today is stark, at least to some of us. And that it is not a place where necessarily there is equity of any kind. So what is the role of the law that the law plays in our life? Many of us here from the feminist movement, from the trans movement, we have turned to law from the 70s, from the 80s increasingly. Today, is law necessarily an enabling mechanism? Does it give me some rights? Does it create a space where different parties can negotiate with equity? Does it protect the vulnerable? Does it protect the marginalized, the impoverished? Or is it an instrument of the state? Often we hear nowadays process as the punishment or weaponization of law. I am increasingly of the view that law is the weapon. There is no longer weaponization of the law going on. Today, law is the weapon. Am I at all advocating abandon the law? No. It's too late in my life, in any case, to abandon the sphere of law. But I am saying to myself and to all friends that the critical interrogation of the law today is very, very necessary. It is the legitimacy of the law through which the state is functioning. And standing between using the law exclusively as a weapon, we don't see any other use of the law at all. The rest is reduced to schemes. schemes in any case, how they pan out, what they give, what they don't give, what is the levels of corruption, etc., is a very different, is a narrative that many of you here are more familiar with. But the purpose of law has been totally turned on its head. Yet it carries a certain legitimacy with it. And perhaps that is what we will need to find the vocabulary to today challenge, to reconfigure, not to abandon, but how do you move from rule by law to rule of constitutionalism? Perhaps just like the Adivasis, the people of Kashmir knew this. They have only known the coercive powers of the law. Unfortunately, we all either didn't comprehend or chose to stay silent or were a little muted because everything, as Stan said, has consequences. And it will. It will have consequences. But they experience law in that manner, so we don't see them necessarily going to any courts asking for anything, again, unless they are dragged to it. The role of human rights defenders, whether we talk of Stan, Bhima Koregaon, the young student leaders, young Muslim leaders in the Delhi riot cases, or Tista Setalwad, again a friend of many of us. When I say that law has become the weapon, I think after what has happened in Tista's case, there is, the fog has kind of cleared if there was any left. We know, Henry knows, everybody who has worked with any victim or survivor. Let me take a case that Henry and I are doing together. When the woodcutters belonging to Tamil Nadu were shot dead by the police of Andhra Pradesh in the forest of Seshachalam, saying that they were stealing red sandalwood, and fired at the STF, and so STF fired back and all the woodcutters died. They belonged to very poor families, came from villages of Tamil Nadu. If they were going to go and search for work in Andhra Pradesh, there must be a level of poverty that compels someone. So does the system, and particularly the Supreme Court of India, imagine that these woodcutters, of which few escaped miraculously, would they have reached the High Court, the National Human Rights Commission, challenged the version of the STF, asked questions, and said this was not an encounter? There is no such word as an encounter. It is a perversion created by the Indian police. It's an extrajudicial killing. Could it have been done if a human rights organization, a human rights defender, did not stand by their side, did not take up the matter with statutory bodies, with the National Human Rights Commission, file writ petitions in the then Andhra Pradesh High Court? They wouldn't have been able to do it, and the system knows that. So who do you have to remove from this story? You have to remove the human rights defenders. So let's put them away. Let's incarcerate them. What is Tista's crime? Yes, she stood by the victims of 2002. Yes, those victims could not have taken on the impunity of the state alone. I am not in the least undermining the role played by the victim survivors, but I am saying these are struggles we do jointly. And we must do them jointly. That is our role to play. We will not shy away from them. The state is saying, why was she there? Knowing fully well. We know as women's rights activists, sometimes even a woman who has suffered domestic violence cannot do it on her own until and unless there is a women's rights organization accompanying her to court, helping her get her act together. That is the nature of things. Because the reason you are subjected to violence is because there is greater power on the other side, and surely there can be no greater power than that of the state. Today, it is the human rights defender, it is the activist who the state fears the most. Everybody knows in the Bhima Koregaon matter, reports have come out that this material, so-called material, on the basis of which they are incarcerated since June 2018. We are in July 2022. There is no merit. It is false. And yet the Supreme Court has this peculiar coinage of phrase. Trial has not begun, for a reasonable period of time has passed. And for now that reasonable period seems to set the clock at 6 to 7 years. Who allows the state to keep people behind bars without a trial for 6 to 7 years? You prove a case against me in a court of law and then punish. But to keep people away is what you have been doing with Adivasis, you have been doing with many others, and today the same thing is being done with human rights defenders. And that is why Stan's murder is an institution, Stan's death is an institutional murder. We are talking of a time when perhaps there is no limit to the vengeance of the state. Each time this happens, there's a very common thing that friends say. It's unbelievable they're doing this. I think we need to stop thinking that there is a level or threshold at which this can stop. I'm a practicing atheist. I have been a confirmed atheist for very long. But I'm beginning to believe there is something called good and evil, because evil is stark today. So, when you hear about things like, when we were studying in law school and for many years thereafter, when we actually did win cases, when movements and social justice movements were at the forefront, there was a time which many of you have been active participants of that journey. And therefore we know that that time will come back. It can't be taken away from us forever. But it's small things which make me say there is no limit to vengeance. If you look at judgments of the Supreme Court written in the 80s, they talk about that the rights of a prisoner a prisoner is not shorn of his rights at the gates of the prison. They're written in words which are inspiring and lofty. And yet yesterday you read, mosquito nets will not be allowed to the Bhima Koregaon under trials, or rather pre-trials. They are not under trials. There is no trial. In Bombay, in the monsoons, mosquito nets will not be provided. And yet we hear the Supreme Court write reams and reams on Article 21 and dignity of the individual. But the actions of the executive and its agents are actually telling us a very, very different story. The last week and more, we have seen a young journalist, fact checker, who tweets. He has challenged people. And there is I understand why anybody who is challenging misinformation is a threat, because the politics is today being rooted through manipulation and misinformation, diversion and distraction, and there is a large audience for it. And if that audience is alerted to repeated misinformation, disinformation, who knows? Some of them may actually start saying that, hey, there's something else happening here. And therefore that young man, of course, he is a Muslim, but he was not performing any role as a Muslim, he was performing a role as an Indian citizen, is being incarcerated in cases which, if somebody had asked me 10 years ago, I would have laughed and said, come on, nobody's going to put him into jail for such things. And even if some police, oppression of the police is not new, and in some segments of our country, like I said, the Adivasis, the Kashmiris, the Dalits, they've always known police to only be repressive. We've had the privilege perhaps of not experiencing that continuously. Ask someone who's been a trans person what is the interface with the police. But today, systemically, we see that the rule of law is undermined, subverted, and will not be allowed to work. And that is a challenge, because where do we turn? So let me give some positive ways in which I think we can. This is not meant to be a depressing story. We cannot have a stand lecture where we think there's nothing to do and it's all doom and gloom ahead. The Supreme Court put in abeyance the law of sedition. Why? It need not have done it. More and more people could have been picked up. Maybe this very lecture could have been termed seditious and all of us would be running hither and thither with our FIRs. Who can stop the police from lodging an FIR? There is no law in this country which says that if the police lodges a false FIR against you, I mean, there is a law, but I don't know a court that has ever held up the police accountable. The law is sitting in the books. Why did the court, Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of India, feel compelled to stay the crime of sedition? I appeared in that case along with many lawyers at the Supreme Court. That voice had risen so strongly and sharply from the country, from society, from criticism abroad, that it was no longer tenable for the court to allow this kind of, and the abuse of which was writ large every day. Not just journalists, activists. And the fact that it had become simply a tool for every government, not just one, not just the regime in the center, but every government in every state has used it to choke and throttle the voice of citizens and would continue to use it. The criticism of it did not begin last year or 2 years ago. There was legal scholarship done by young lawyers. The name of someone like Siddharth Narayan comes to mind. He did a lot of work on writing about sedition. Many other lawyers wrote. Research scholars wrote. Journalists wrote. Documentation was done. Media Portal Article 14 did a comprehensive documentation. Activists were holding meetings repeatedly saying this has to go. In the United Nations, freedom of expression, UN special rapporteurs, everybody was critiquing. And therefore it became no longer tenable to have that operating in a constitutional democracy. India never tires, and Henry knows that better than most, of calling itself the largest democracy. Largest, of course, is a matter of numbers. It's not an achievement. So when they go to the UN to finish the Supreme Court story, We, the people of this country, made it impossible for this provision to be there in the penal code. It is not an act of charity that the court did for us. Was the legislature ever going to put it aside? No. Why would anybody get rid of its favorite weapon in the armory? Nobody would do it. No government would do it. When the Indian state goes to the United Nations, and it does go, for many reasons. Of course, if anybody in the UN says anything, or any foreign power says anything that is even mildly critical, the retaliation and the snub by the Indian state is rather abrupt, if not abusive. So India goes to the UN for various reasons. There are various processes and mechanisms that India is part of. And at that juncture, its only shield is the Indian Constitution. The same Constitution which has increasingly less and less role to play in any form of governance that exists, even in the praxis of governance that is being carried out by the government or in our lives, but that is their shield over there. And they will cite chapter and verse to any criticism. They will talk about chapter 3, fundamental rights will be cited, how the checks and balances are maintained by the Supreme Court of India, checks and balances that I think is wavering and is on shaky ground today, until and unless our voices put it back where it needs to be. There is no magic wand going to put it back. Very soon India will again be going for the Universal Periodic Review in November of 2022, where there will be a peer review by other countries. I'm sure they will do their backroom IFS, they call it diplomacy. It's basically to tell which country not to ask us difficult questions, which country will ask us completely vague questions, and which country will say our RTI law is the best and can we please export it everywhere. I see Venkatesh smiling at the back. We know what is happening to the RTI law here. At that peer review, since 2007, India has been asked repeatedly to do things like ratify the Convention Against Torture. Surely the largest democracy is not condoning torture. They send their senior most law officer, I don't know who they plan to send this time, whose only defense is chapter 3 of the Indian Constitution. Then they clutch at Gandhi and Ambedkar and they cite that. These are live streamed, and I think we should watch and we should ask them questions, because the language that is used there is no longer part of what we even hear anybody speak. We hear our ministers, members of the political party speak in language which actually to me I only hear different provisions of the Indian Penal Code when I hear people speak from the government. So there is a lot of room for resistance. Of course, we are told, why do you want to protest? What is there to protest? There is a government in charge. Now all of you keep quiet. They will run the country. Democracy was never practiced by the state, ever, by any state in the world. Democracy has only been practiced by the people. Today what we are seeing is a demolition of the rule of law by the state, an active, targeted demolition of the rule of law. And the targeting is of Muslims, of human rights defenders, of certain groups who are either portrayed as enemies or seen as threats to the new regime that is sought to be put in place. Therefore, it will be a resistance that will be carved out of many creative strategies. And at least for myself, I would say a revisiting of many paradigms that we thought were there to ensure some level of equality, non-discrimination, justice, etc. What I see today happening in lives of ordinary people, but more particularly, definitely in the lives of the poor. The poor again never go to courts of law. They're taken through different, if you go to a court of law at 2 p.m., somebody has been brought in, he was gambling on the road. Somebody is brought in, he was hawking on the streets. Because the law has rendered them illegal, has rendered their lives illegal. So the legal mayhem that they have always experienced has today cast its net wider. So perhaps it's exactly what Father Stan Swamy was pushing us to understand and think about, and what his last message to his friends were. We have to join hands with those who have faced this targeting and have envisaged life differently. This system of law will not work for them. This system of law will now work in a certain manner. So we have to question it. We have to interrogate it. We have to challenge it. It is premised on assumptions that the police is going to catch the bad guys. Please look around you. The police has not caught any of the bad guys for a very long time, and we know it. So the basic presumptions and assumptions on the edifice of which this was built are no longer true. So we need to perhaps develop a new understanding to create systems which will have to be different and perhaps multiple and varied, where what the legal system needs to do, to put it very pithily, is to the one who has the greatest power must be subject to the greatest accountability, and that would be the true inversion of the colonial legal system that we live in. If you hear the Home Minister, he's repeatedly been saying, these are colonial laws. We need to get rid of them. I actually agree. But his description of what they're going to bring in and my vague ideas of what we should bring in may perhaps be very different. In fact, the Home Ministry is going to bring in. It is a matter of time, and it's something that I am at least very, very apprehensive of what is coming our way. They are rewriting many, many parts of the Indian Penal Code, the Criminal Procedure Code, the Indian Evidence Act. In the name of these were written by colonial masters. There can be some things that are quite decent in it. The Indian Evidence Act protects us, say, from statements given to the police. There's nothing wrong with it. We don't need to turn everything on its head. It is the principle and the rationale underlying which needs to be seen. So in the name of Indianizing law, because everything is from some glorious Hindu past, not Indian past, what is going to be offered? In Parliament, there will be no debate, and there has been no debate, and there is a brute majority. The debate will have to be in these forums, that what will we accept as our laws that will govern us. The smallest chapter in the Indian Penal Code is the chapter that creates accountability for public servants and the state. Why? That is the colonial remnant. The greatest power, including over our lives, is in the hands of the state. So it is the state who needs to be made most and completely accountable. Today, in the Hindu, there is a review of a book written by an Egyptian activist whose name who's been incarcerated for long. I don't know of his politics or who he is, but he's somebody who apparently has been a critique of almost every regime. And he has a book, the book that he has written, it's a set of articles from the prison. There's a new genre, again. And I say again because it was there during the independence movement, of prison diaries being written and articles. We know Vernon Gonsalves wrote an article of Stan Swamy, which was published by Scroll a few days ago. This book by the Egyptian activist is called "We Are Not Defeated Yet." I only read the review this morning. There are images today of what is happening in Sri Lanka. A very powerful, authoritarian, majoritarian, military, dictator, family oligarch. Gone. I am not a huge votary, and people may not agree with me. Experience from the Egyptian revolution, Tunisian revolution shows not necessarily that events like this create pathways necessarily for routes for justice. So I'm not a votary of charging into homes and that kind of movement. But what the point that I'm trying to take from Sri Lanka is that there is an end, and that this kind of brutal Sri Lanka experienced disappearances, mass murders, mass graves, you name it, and every crime against humanity was inflicted on the people of, particularly the Tamils of Sri Lanka. But they can be thrown out, and it's important to keep that hope and that determination alive. I know I'm in the south where Hindi is not popular, but you will pardon me, I am going to recite 2 lines of Faiz in Urdu, not Hindi. दिल ना उम्मीद तो नहीं, नाकाम ही तो है, लंबी है गम की शाम, मगर शाम ही तो है. Our friends, Teesta Setalwad, Bhima Koregaon, Delhi riots, they will all be back with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. The revisiting, I was wondering where the revisiting will end. And the revisiting ended with this hope of what is taking place. And we all, I'm sure it was all also reverberating the same sense of hope that you spoke of. We are all in different stages of our life. We have different people who are close to us, watching us, sometimes staying with us, sometimes working with us. Those who know me understand perfectly what I'm saying. Our work spots are completely different. I work in a very interesting work spot these days. I work in a ground floor, and the CBA is on my first floor. That's simple as that.
They're not his tenants.
They're not tenants. They're investigating for the last 6 months. So if I also elaborate the same hope, it is this hope that we really derive from people like Stan. And in these difficult times to also, for all of us to feel that in different parts of the country there are people with a lot of hope. a lot of them who don't speak loud, who don't speak publicly, but are known in private circles to be extremely critical. And that critical word is still existing. And I think many of them whom I'm referring to are also in this hall at this point in time, listening to what I'm saying. So that hope is real, Brinda, and therefore without wanting this flow of hope for teachers, or hope for Sri Kumar, or hope for many others who are inside, and for many of us who will be joining them, are there questions in the audience to Brinda? This is your time. In these public fora, it is important that we know who asks the questions. You understand what I mean? So,
this is a question.
yourself, please.
I'm Kennedy Michael, and it's a question to Henry and other seniors.
Question is to Brinda.
Yes, sir. The question is, Stan Mughal responded to then emergency. Even though the church, the official church, the main churches welcomed the emergency, how he was for to stand by justice.
We started with a tough question. The church is also very much present here. Can you repeat that? Any other questions? Yes.
Even after I'm big fan of
Your good name, please, sir.
my name is Rajesh. So I'm a lecturer. I'm a social, even though I do some social work. I question, even I am feeling what is that difficult to question nowadays. Because of even this kind of big man itself not received the justice. So like many youngsters, they want that. So this kind of forums, even after his death also, somewhere what is that justice, questioning the capacity we are losing, that is what my feeling. And what I'm going to give to me through your what is that?
Thank you, Ramesh.
Confident answer.
Yeah, answer the
Suppose I cannot able to question nowadays because that big man itself, the central government made fine. So, like me youngsters, how in future we can question? Even our own circle itself, they will tell us that don't question. Try to look after yourself.
Thank you, Ramesh. Thank you. I'll take one more question and then we go to. Anybody else?
Maybe we'll start there. Maybe start.
Yes, Asha.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm Asha Ramesh. First and foremost, I want to congratulate you for very, very inspiring and intellectual. My question is, as you know, the Lord wants to demonstrate and do so much. Today we are not able to do that. How can we really get back to that state? We need to get back that far.
how do we continue to demonstrate, not in Freedom Park, but elsewhere. Bengaluru style. Bengaluru style is Freedom Park.
I'm located. I'm a student of the United Theological College. And I think I'll be repeating what the previous questions have been asked. You have seen that wherever there is dissent, wherever there is critique, wherever there is a comment or even a meme, the state is targeting. And we know about Tista, Satarwal and Muhammad Zubair because they are advertisers. Today, I think we are also remembering, I'm not sure that remembering is a good word, but we are thinking of Siddiqa because he was arrested and has been in jail for 1,000 days just for traveling to Honduras. So in this context, these are no people because they have human rights agencies or other forums backing them. And even then, they are interested. So how can the common man, the common person, without taking up of his backing, do it? Is it possible for them for us to do?
Yeah, the first one. Yeah. I will be answering only what Kennedy has asked. Yes, the time of emergency had been very tough. Many of us, some of us are not born at that time, but some of us elders knew what was happening and they were ready to face the situation. When you talk about Stan and the church, why the church is in such a situation, I don't know, my mind only went to this particular time. After Stan's death, I was talking to his brother. I said, how are you? He gave me an indication. Father, many priests, religious bishops used to tell me, tell your brother not to critique the church, not to speak against the church. And many of them are highly appreciated today. This is the big change that has happened. It's, I think, those moments which also change the church. The church always, the institutional church with all its luggage finds it difficult. It needs persons like Stan to kindle fire. Stan has done it. And I think it's not complete. We still have to do a lot, which this institutional church and the Society of Jesus not somehow to generate passion among those younger generations who are looking for it. We can't afford to fail the generation which has faith in us.
Let me start from the emergency and then try and answer very difficult questions that you have asked. I was in school, I think I was in class 8 when the emergency happened. My father was a regular, very prominent criminal lawyer of Delhi. He was not aligned, to any politics or anything like that. He was just a prominent lawyer. And in the course of his work, he had done some cases as a professional criminal lawyer, in which Sanjay Gandhi happened to be on the other side. No political leanings or affiliation whatsoever. And yet when the emergency happened, my father knew instinctively that they were going to come after everybody. So he, being the wily criminal lawyer that he was, had left home already so that the cops didn't pick him up. But I remember it was my mother and 3 of us as children all in school when the midnight knock did come and the cops did come to our house, and we were not fully understanding what the problem was, and they looked around, they saw my father was not there and they left. My father was able to manage that he never got arrested, and after a month or so he returned home. He always thought of himself as somebody who just did his work. He was a professional lawyer. He didn't want to do anything more, anything less. He was doing well in his profession. For the first time in the elections that happened post the emergency, he actually went to the street corner meetings in our area where we were residing to actually speak at those meetings. because it was no longer an option to be apolitical and that I have nothing to do with politics or elections, because everybody's liberty was now at stake. He was not affiliated. In fact, my family had always been a Congress voter and supporter. And yet that didn't come in the way when the emergency happened, and then the net was cast far and wide. What we are going through today is way, way more than the emergency, because the emergency would have a temporality and a proclamation, and one would understand how to then conduct, and institutions would know. When you ask what is to be done, there are 2-3 ways of thinking of it. I don't have answers ever. That's why I said this is not a lecture, it's a conversation of very raw thoughts, but thoughts that are troubling me. One, I feel it really is no longer an option that should I speak out or should I not speak out. For some reason or the other, they can get you. So if you don't speak out or if you do speak out, will make the difference between whether this regime's suppression and repression will continue unchallenged. As I mentioned, the sedition case, it changes when we do speak, and there are multiple ways of speaking. Speaking doesn't necessarily mean that we have to all get together and start saying something in a very offensive way necessarily. I think there are different people have different ways in which they express and throw ideas. It's really about throwing ideas into a space where I don't think we are any longer a polarized society. I think we are a completely divided society where hate is ruling. These are very, very brutal facts that we must hit. And I at least don't believe in the EVM stuff. I think people are voting for hate. And that is what we must reckon with. Will they, one thing that you said, I'm glad you mentioned Siddiq Kapil. And I also want to mention here something which I want to correct something that I have said. There is a young Bahujan lawyer called Disha Wadekar. She wrote an article recently on political prisoners, and she critiqued the category of us using the phrase political prisoners. And she sent me her article. She said, what do you think of this? And I think there is a lot of merit in the argument she's making. I'm still thinking it through, but I think the idea that she's putting forward is actually correct. We are wrong. She's saying when you classify certain people, and these are obviously people that we know, and we know them because somewhere they are part of the same group, circuit, class that we belong to. You eclipse many others who are also suffering, perhaps incarceration, which say was what Stan was trying to bring out about the large numbers of Adivasis whose names we may not know ever. And she said the category of political prisoners is actually doing a disservice to who is suffering. And I think Disha Wadekar's article one needs to think through how to, then what are the classifications? Because when you do political activism, when you do writing of this kind, you do need categories. But what are those categories? I think she's right. We need to find newer ways of expressing ourselves. About whether one speaks or doesn't speak, yes, there is fear. I don't think there's any point in denying fear. And I think fear is natural and normal and human. Women understand fear very early in life. I often come, my office and home are very, very close by in the same block. I often return from office very late at night. I have to walk a very, very short stretch alone. But there is a little thing that niggles me, and I know that it's close, I know everybody there, but still there's something. So fear is very human. I don't think we need to shy away from these things. The point is that with that fear, how do I work with it? How do I make it work for myself? And if I remain silent, will this go away? It won't. Will I be spared? I don't think so. So we are really, I don't think we have choices. Our choices is in expressing greater and greater solidarity, talking more and more. The larger our numbers, the safer we are. Yes, Teesta is inside. Yes, Zubair is inside. Yes, we are fighting for them. But we also fight for many others who are not known. It's not that we don't or we won't. If those woodcutters were killed, Henry and his people reached their villages, found the families, and moved ahead. It is our only hope is in standing up and speaking out. This is not going to be wished away. Institutions cannot do it, and they can do it. They can do it. They will not do it. We will do it because this is not the country we want. This is not the place we want to live in. Those activists who are incarcerated, they are not saying they are going to change their politics. They are not succumbing to saying, oh my God, I've suffered so much, I better compromise and come out somehow. None of them are going to agree to any form of exploitation or any discriminatory rule or law that the government is passing. They are going to nonetheless speak out against it. I think we can work together, and we should be honest about fear. What is the greatest fear? And this a lot of friends say, it's not unusual, this conversation is happening everywhere. A lot of lawyers say, I'm not going to do this because they'll put me into jail. And then I look at friends who've gone, and Stan who has died and been murdered institutionally. So that's the worst they can do to us. I don't know any society that recovered from this without going through something. And I think we have in our midst, at least for me, the fact that they stand by their politics and conviction is what gives me strength and hope. Fear stays with you. You don't need to admonish yourself with it.
Yes, please.
I am Father Arun, staying in Bangalore. We are trying to raise our voice in a small way in the city of Bangalore. But what has recently happened is, court has given an order. The High Court of Karnataka, you cannot protest anywhere else except in Freedom Park. And it is a godforsaken place where we can't, nobody comes, nobody knows, and you know the present day media now. So we are a rally of all the Dalit organizations. Over 25,000 people came. They took a rally from railway station to the Freedom Park. But nothing came in, not even in a single print media or the media, any of the TV channels. So we are also, whenever we want to raise our voice, we have to go there, sit ourselves like 20, 25 people, or say 100 people. The other day we had around 350 people. But no one will know and nobody will know what's happening there. And we have been reduced by the judiciary to this system. I just wanted to know, is there any way out? Can anybody challenge this in the High Court that we have the right to protest anything? Only the other day we had a sudden protest in one or two places, but suddenly 150 policemen come and chase you away. So in this situation, it has become very difficult even to raise our voice. Very difficult to raise the voice and very this is the situation. And when the executive and judiciary work in tandem, it becomes very difficult for us. I just wanted to know what could be done in this particular situation. So this is
Anybody else? Yes.
I will speak loudly.
I know you are extremely low. Yeah.
Use the mic.
I just wanted to reflect on one simple thing.
And most of the people who are fond of this are the people who are the rightists, like Devte and such people, RSS, BJP people. They talk about the process of law. Let the process of law take. And I would like to suggest that the process of law that they talk is the process of the state, repressive state. Now, to oppose that kind of process of law, I think what Brinda you suggested that we have the process of people's movement. And I think that is the only way. The law, of course, you say you have great faith in law and all, but then means the law is turned into a process. Because when Stan was arrested, he asked the police, do you have warrant, do you have this, that? And they told him, we don't require any of this. I mean, they were superb. And that is called the process of law.
Addition to this, in connection with the North States, the police and the governors allowed that many of the protest processions, thousands and thousands, respectively, Sri Ram procession, second by the revenue minister, Mr. Ashok. And before that, there's a Karga, there's a festival in Bangalore. Thousands of people used to come. The same High Court has given the permission. And followed by, after the law has been ordered to the people, in one day there is a big protest near the town hall. It's a private place. And also near the Vice It's a heavy traffic jam. It's a peak place of the capital city. So, how to come out of this?
As I said before,
I'll ask, Arvind, I'll finish and then come back to you.
as I said before, I never have answers. So I'm not going to sit here as some genius with some answers to anything. In fact, this designated place is has come from the Supreme Court judgment following the anti-CA protests, where the women of Shaheen Bagh took over the streets, and that protest galvanized the whole country, and they just occupied the streets to make their presence and protest felt. And of course, taking the alibi of COVID and others, that whole thing was then not only crushed but demonized and criminalized. What the state is doing is wrong under international law. It's wrong under the Constitution. Do you have a court today that will hear? These are actually strategy decisions. I, for one, do not ever suggest to people rush to court, because that seems as though we have some blind faith that this institution is going to just give something. We are all smart enough to know what is happening. So if today the court is not willing to adhere to its own precedents, and there are precedents, and if you're interested, I'm happy to share. I did a report recently on freedom of assembly, which is a published report which actually looks into this aspect and then looks at both Indian precedent, international law, and what they say about these things. And what you mentioned about how international law says that the state response to freedom of assembly has to be content neutral. You are saying it is partisan, and therefore on all those counts, actually the regime's actions can be challenged. But should they be challenged as strategic decisions, which we have to take astutely, because we are not, we understand the manner in which power flows through the legal system and elsewhere. So I suppose one needs to wait for moments where, and there will be moments, and there always are moments in any society's history where people will feel so strongly and that they will come out on the streets and not at Freedom Park. And there are moments when the state is then not able to push them away. When you said that such a large gathering of Dalit activists and Dalits came, And yes, the media did not cover it, but then the media actually rarely covers, or if at all it's a workers' march, the only thing that they say in the headlines next day is something about how they cause traffic jams on the road. And that's the only description that we see of workers' march, at least in the north, that's the only, except when the farmers' movement happened. The farmers did not sit at any designated spot. The Supreme Court did not venture into it. That's what I say when I mean there are cycles in a society's history when times will come and people will stand up, and designated spots, that judgment preceded the farmers' movement. But they stood their ground and they sat where they would. They in fact made entire villages over there. It was something none of us had ever seen in our lifetime.
Arvind?
Yeah, thanks for the
Louder, little louder.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I said thanks to both Henry and Brinda for really moving in full family. The two as well for sharing the ways of our stand, which is very good. And I thought both Henry in his introduction and Brinda in the talk was a really nice bond between what you might call reckless optimism and reckless despair. That fine moment where it's such a difficult position to enter. But it doesn't make you give up. And that was a really beautiful way of acknowledging the reality, yet saying that all is not lost. So thank you both for that beautiful approach. But the specific question is more on who leads the performance, motivate with us reflections on. One is this clear judgment. And I thought it spoke of one dimension over which we spoke about, which is the idea that what the state wants to do is ensure that people are in the place, activists are in the place, and bureaucrats in the place, and we don't come together. I thought in a sense, whatever we achieved in terms of the entire cultural movement to social justice was really coming together of activists with victims, with really bureaucrats, very big bureaucrats like Sanjeev Bhatt and other companies. So I wanted to hear any thoughts, and I'm sure many more thoughts on that particular level. And the second thing to just briefly share in the Karnataka context is the anti-conversion ordinance which has been passed by the government. And just bring your attention to one particular provision, which I don't know if UP has it, but we thought of it as an unfortunately more than anybody else actually. The most dangerous part of the ordinance is the language of conversion by endowment. By endowment, they need to specify as specifically as saying, giving of scholarships, giving of medical help, etc. So in a sense, ISI, St. Joseph's, and re-education institution comes in that way. They use the language of conversion, but actually targeting both the freedom of practice, the freedom to profess, the right to charity, faith, everything is really targeting. So just go on.
I think there's a friend.
Yes. Anita, you want? Anita? Yeah. Next, Anita. Yeah.
Good evening, ma'am. Good evening to all members. Actually, my question is better on because as we are observing, I don't understand why so targeting so-called based on religious politics, acquisitive religious politics. If you are observing like from the 5 years, attending on Christians and bringing the age and research. But what we are is supposed to be only one thing as we are a nation. As a nation, we are. Can you?
1 minute. No.
There's a little bit of echo. We are not able to follow. Yeah, this is better. Yeah. Can you just repeat? We didn't follow.
You're closer to speaker, that's why. Just move, come to the front and ask. Just come to the front and ask. Just the
that's
echo,
right.
the speaker echo. Yeah, now speak. Yeah.
Okay, as we are nation, we talk about equality. So, as per my understanding, what I'm thinking, I'm still young, but more than my seniors are aware about the politics and religion concepts of how government are ruling India. Because I observed on the 5 years what I was thinking while sitting, but if you are thinking about like within 5 years, too much of lot of attacking on the Christian movement and the Muslim movement and transgenders coming to people. But still my question is, as a transgenders, we are fighting in society for social justice. But still, when you're lobbying with the government, if you take example, there is a judgment. Without knowledge, keep opposing about the research, what is it? Doesn't know what is research. Simply keep opposing we are not favoring some research. So without knowledge, as a politician, without knowledge, how can you rule in India? And when we talk about, only talks about this, a nation has to be into that, which is not, I'm not favoring, I'm only into that. Because as a nation, we have every religion. We are looking for every respect and we are looking every equality, every opportunity. My question is to you, ma'am, how can you look it out of this? As a religion, still right now, against homophobia mindset people.
Homophobia mindset.
So how can you fight against phobia mindset people? As we transgender, what we can do and how we can fight as a nation. That's my question.
Anita.
I am Anurag's name, I am just
The audience.
about this institutional order of this activity. What is the strategies of using the judicial process about others to get the justice, like, and how to avoid these institutional murders? And also I want to make me as an advocate, I want to know what are the basic procedures we have to know where we can restrain from the institutional murders, and how can we make a responsible of the state? Because in IPC, there is no definition for an institutional murder as I know. So how we can go with this, please? If you explain that.
1 second.
There's been a lot of talk of hope and challenges today, and something that connects to our hearts and to our lives quite intrinsically. The issue that I want to bring about is slightly complex, that even within dissent, there's a hierarchy of privilege. Certain people have the right to dissent, and many times institutions and people like us who are in positions of power, be it in the family or as heads of colleges or teachers in school, are not very open to dissent below them. Dissent remains and is allowed at a certain point for certain people. And now, because of this kind of risk that is perceived, whether it's minority religions, minority communities of any kinds, vulnerabilities, I think the question of difference of opinion and dissent below the power that is being enjoyed or experienced is very, very low. And there is a support for that because of the perceived risk. So how do we support a culture of dissent and difference of opinion that really builds society and also creates a supportive texture or a fabric for the communities of people who actually don't have this.
Thank you, Anita. There was one more there.
Similarly, questions. First question is, we are addressing the issue that obviously interest.
Your voice is echoing, actually we can't hear.
Just come to the center. Yeah, just come to the center. hold the mic straight. Yeah.
When we are representing issue, democracy and movements,
Can't hear
No,
you.
can't hear. Can you hold the
You'll
mic
have to be
straight?
a little louder, please.
Yeah, speak.
when we are using
Yeah.
the theme, democracy and movements defenders, when we are using the simple basic words like poverty, poor, and army, but and also we are saying that states producing and spreading new creative strategies to divide the people. So as a social analysis or social institute or social students, we need a new language to mark the invisible people. Still we are using the poor, poverty and the margins. So how we are really addressing the new language to address the invisible people. The second question is, we are revisiting or addressing democracy and human rights defenders. But are we able to readdress the Savarna culture in our church? Especially we are saying we are addressing revisiting democracy and human rights defenders. In third question is, there is addressing the question democracy and human rights defenders. We are saying that we are always attacking analysis and BJP because now maybe your approach is very different. You mentioned the state. Every state, you said state is not local because I am from Kerala. The youth, they are also kept books inside the bag. The youth are arrested and then so I think when we address the issue of democracy and human rights defenders, the shrinking of the social space is not a spontaneous phenomenon. Are we addressing or revisiting the continuous history from the freedom, from after the independence? So, how we are addressing the history of the India, addressing the democracy and human rights?
Yeah. I don't think I'm equipped to answer all questions. I will begin with the questions that Arvind had posed. The first one being about, what came out in 2002. I would only say this, I don't see this as necessarily the bureaucracy coming together. I think there were a couple of individuals. The bureaucracy per se did not part ways with the state regime. Similarly, we saw actually even with the police. There were some police officers who broke away. They did their job during the violence, the pogrom, and also in the investigation, say, of the extrajudicial killings. And they have each, we know what has happened to the bureaucrats, but even with those 3 police officers, each one has faced severe repression at work, including having to take premature retirement, punishment postings, and the repression continues, it does not end. The state is unforgiving. I don't think any blockist of the government or the state was chipped away. There was few individuals. So I don't think we were, I think there were the victims and the activists came together, yes. And I think again, as you well know, it also gave much food for thought for all of us as to the nature of activism. How do you take these very difficult struggles forward? Who should be the face of that struggle? Whose narrative should be foregrounded? So it is a very complicated, complex story. The state, in fact, turns it into a black and white story for itself. I think for us, that story should remain complex because I think it then ties into perhaps the last question that was asked or question that Anita, issues that Anita has raised, because it is also to look at our own forms of activism and whether this kind of activism or this kind of spearheading of struggles, if it is done differently, I'm not for a moment saying the state won't target, but are there ways in which we can also create disruptions in the way the state targets us and create confusions for the state, and the story becomes different. And I think somewhere our own narratives had also to be different. And those are all things that one will be thinking through and chatting and discussing even as the state, of course, totally transforms it into a different discourse for its own gain. And the court does some bizarre thing of endorsing, without any material before it, a version that we don't know from where they heard and how they came to these conclusions. Your second question on allurement, and yes, it's quite clear who it is lashing out at and who it seeks to bring within the net are those who provided education through missionary schools, etc., hospitals. That's clearly the target here. I'm not sure that allurement is a new thing. It is there in the UP law, identical to Karnataka. Karnataka has some ways in which they've tweaked it to make the challenge actually more difficult. The UP law is more crude. But I think allurement existed even in the Odisha Freedom of Religion Act, without the examples. But the term allurement per se, because if you look at the Himachal judgment, which Justice Deepak Gupta had given when he was the chief, I'm forgetting the name of the judgment just now, there allurement had not been disbanded. So we'll have to go back a little bit to that. What was the next question? You hear this?
Anita was on the dissent.
Anita, I'm just going to take the opportunity of what you had asked to say something else also. You know, I don't think they're only targeting dissent. I think all of freedom of speech is to be curbed. And either the master's voice will be heard, or the meta-discourse is to be heard. The meta-narrative is to be heard. I think the attack is no longer confined to dissent. It is on no speech, unless you are simply echoing what has been said. And that is part of the reason that people are all feeling uncertain about speaking per se. Because that's why it's innocuous things that people have said. Completely, you know, what you would say, if somebody said this, who cares? But it gets suddenly some strange attention and traction, both on social media and from the authorities. And as I said, you know, by the time, so it's become commonplace now to use this phrase process as punishment. I think the problem is actually much more severe. It's not about process as punishment. That's definitely true for the way to silence human rights defenders, particularly who work on the ground and organize people. That's why they are at the forefront of receiving this particular kind of incarceration and UAP, etc., that they can't get out of. But it is also about no speech. And learn to not comment or critique. It's actually a training we are all being put into. And I like the question that you asked, and I want to actually use that, or the issues that you raised actually, not question. I want to use that actually to talk about something else that I didn't speak about here. And I've been talking about this to friends in Delhi. I think particularly the women's rights movement has to completely recraft its language. Authoritarian regimes will stand up for certain kinds of women's rights, and for certain kinds of minority rights, for certain kinds of transgender rights. How do we critically engage at that juncture becomes very challenging at times, because it's something that is seen as, well, they are doing something which we've been asking for. So if this kind of state gives that kind of dribble, whether it is the triple talaq or whatever, although that comes from the Supreme Court, they keep saying they've done it. How does one engage, and how does one speak differently so that the state speak and our speak sounds very different? And I think it's a challenge that the women's rights movement cannot afford to ignore anymore. Because that merging and conflating of voices is taking place repeatedly. But on the point of, and I think you and the question there are actually, the institutional questions are interlinked. And perhaps one of the reasons why we've not been able to make the kind of headways is because maybe inherently we are not practicing a lot of that equality, particularly in institutional mechanisms. We don't see that happening. And so it doesn't, it's a habit that we have to inculcate. These are cultural habits. They don't exist in our society naturally. Definitely not a society that is caste stratified cannot have a natural inclination for equality, and it will be something we will have to work towards and institutionally work towards. So I think that's an important reminder you give us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You come to this mic, that will be better.
He wants you to go there.
This is better. It will be more forceful there. Yes.
President, I'm conscious that it's getting late for you, but I can't resist the temptation of reading out from Volken's letter from the prison, where he refers to Stan's anger. I think there's a lot of us who have lots to learn from, and those who know Stan very well, I'm sure will elaborate this. I'm not going to read the entire letter, it's a long one, but portions, just one or two which are important. We didn't know all this when you and I together read your charge sheet in October and November 2020. We only came to know the criminal bonus authority when the forensic reports came from the US, from the arsenal consulting and others. I still recall the look on your face. First, bewilderment. Such stuff never was on your table. Then a deep sense of sadness when you realize the devilish deviousness of their plot, but no anger. Stan, I think you are quite a stranger to anger. And that's what forced the people that run the prison. Rage, resentment, and rebellion from prisoners is their daily cup of tea, which they cow down with violence and cunning. But how do you combat? Same things. They retreated in confusion. What they initially may have thought as your facade, they soon realized was a deep goodness that they perhaps hadn't encountered before. But they remained faithful to the institution, to the edifice that had embarked on later came to be known as your institutional mother, and then it goes on. And I think this whole question of anger, hope that we have been speaking of, for many of us who would perhaps dread the day which is marked as our day, I think there's a lot to learn from this. And I think on a day when we do this memorial lecture and listen to the need to rethink many of our own positions in the past, I think we need to possess within that strength to be able to withstand the state at its worst and prepare ourselves personally for the day that is ahead of us. Brinda was referring this afternoon to this island called, she didn't refer to the way I'm saying it, to this island called Tamil Nadu. And I come from that island called Tamil Nadu. Many people are eyeing the state. But don't forget, this came through occupying streets. This was not built by DMK. The DMK is the beneficiary of a variety of constituencies I'm talking about. It is no longer the exclusivity of the blues, the blacks, and the reds or the whites. Whites meaning these whites also. And the real white was here. The blues, the blacks, the reds, the whites are there for everybody who's in distress. And this started prior to the elections, many years prior to the elections. And it is these movements which face, right from Puranam onwards, you name the movements, these movements which paved the way for Stalin and his party to toe a line which was dictated by movements by occupying the streets. And I think that the solution is occupying the streets. It's very easy for me to say this. I know the context outside are different. But that coming together of people beyond our small little circles has been the lesson I have personally learned every day by moving with a variety of movements who allowed us to move with them, who allowed us to work with them, allowed us to consider them as defenders, and had the humility sometimes to listen to what we had to say. Veteran leaders having the willingness to listen to some of us who are not mass leaders at all. And I think that occupation of street, therefore, is something which I think was also spoken of earlier. But the island state is also being eaten on the rims, and we are aware of it. The eating is already started. The ruining has started. Volken has started, Kanyamapuri has started, Volken has started, but the resistance is definitely there, which is ideology. I thought this sense of hope has to be given. And one thing for all of us here is to ensure that those who don't fall within these categories of political prisoners, the visible human rights defenders, the thousands of invisible human rights defenders need us. And the thousands of human rights defenders for whom stand had spoken, had litigated, the litigation pending in courts, they are still there in prison. In Jharkhand, they are still in prison. And I think for many of us, our concentrations are and have to be to look at those so-called invisible people who remain in prisons because they don't have access to effective lawyers. They have access sometimes to lawyers, but not effective lawyers. And for each one of us to always understand that such people whom we may call defenders, may refer as defenders or not, that they are brought within the realm of some protection to ensure that when they are in difficulty, either in prison or outside prison, that we are able to reach out to them. I think that is a resolve we undertake today. Not to only look for those who are visible, but the invisible, and there are plenty of them. And people like me, the challenge is to reach out precisely to those invisible who are not, whose names are not known. I think it is important also today to continue to commit a collective voice. Don't forget there is a very strong international voice. International resolutions passed in different parliaments, houses of representatives, calling for an independent, impartial inquiry into the death of Stalin. The international voice is so strong, my dear friends, that a person like Justice Arun Mishra goes for advocacy work in Geneva, in Brussels last week. It is no longer your advocacy. Arun Mishra believes in advocacy. He engages an advocacy firm in Brussels who reaches out to human rights organizations, international NGOs in Brussels, because he is bothered about the accreditation of the HRC coming up to 2023. It is time we buck up for the UPR4 in November 2022. Arun Mishra is setting our path. But the NGOs there told him, please go back and meet the NGOs in India before you come and meet us here. And if you want to meet us directly, you don't need to come through an advocacy firm. We are also trying RTAs to find out how much the embassy is paying the advocacy firm for the work they are doing for Arun Mishra. Friends, the UPR 2022 should be a mass movement, because that building of a mass movement based on the UPR reports that many of you here have been party to variety of reports on a variety of themes, I think is the call for all of us today to ensure that in November 2022, when the UPR hearing takes place in Geneva, and the lives are unfolded there for those 3 hours, those lives are seen by us, not individually, but in communities, in groups, by trade unions, by political parties, by congregations. Block your prayer because that will happen during your night prayer, sisters, and ensure that the best prayer that day is to ensure that you watch the lives of the government of India with the same. The reports, the stakeholder reports that many of us have been party to, I think that is a clear action. And then go public and say, we saw your lives, we heard your lives, we saw you dying. I think that is a very concrete action plan. WTHR, to which we all belong to, is trying to move this forward, but that is not enough. I'm reminded of Arvind, Babu, Margaret, Athusadev and all who led some process here for several days. That process has to multiply several-fold, so that trade unions and movements and women's organizations and Dalit organizations and organizations resolve that in November 2022, when the UPR is actually taking place, we will watch, we will protest, and we will go public, and what all we can sit there is if it is nice, then it is nice. I think that is something that we should come forward with. And in Bangalore, for those who are in Bangalore, you have enough embassies in Bangalore. Don't go to these embassies for anything else. Go meet the German embassy here, consular embassy here. Go to the Dutch and all of them are here. I don't know if you've got an embassy road if I am right. But go to the embassies. Let them understand that the government, the citizens of this country are bothered about the statements they are going to make, the questions they are going to ask. I think it is not to leave it to the Delhi walas to raise it in the embassies there, but for these people to say, but in Bangalore, all the embassies and civil society groups, I think this is the amount of pressure that we have to start putting. Don't depend on Geneva actions and Delhi actions, believe in Chennai actions and Bengaluru actions and Mumbai actions and Kolkata actions. These are really going to have lots of opportunities for us to go forward. These are some of the few things I actually wanted to say. There are many more, but the result really today is for us to ensure that those for whom he stood and the co-accused with him in the 124A sedition matter and the related matters, which brought him actually to Bangalore for a long period of time, a combination of several places in South India. I think those people to ensure before anything happens in Jharkhand, to ensure that those cases are quashed. I think these are some efforts that were on his anniversary. There were movements which have come out with the report to remind us of tasks that we have forgotten. And I think for me, I remind myself, and I share what I reminded myself of the resolve to ensure that the people who are arriving in Stan's minds, always directly him, are the people who should be arriving in my own mind, your mind, to ensure that they are not forgotten at all. These memories, these memorials lose their strength if we forget the people for whom he stood for and spoke for and then finally gave his life for. I think with these words, I'm a very hopeful person. I draw a lot of hope. Means about my hope, but without hope, there is nothing else that can sustain us. And that hope has to be a hope today that transcends all the small little belongings we have. Whether we call ourselves trade union, whether we call ourselves labor activists, and looking at somebody who would mind me to say that we are all one. Wherever we are all one. And the oneness of all of us in the street is what is going to make the change. And that is how hope is going to realize into reality. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good, thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Brinda Grover, for this thought-provoking conversation. Thank you, Advocate Henry, for moderating the lecture and offering your insights from your personal experiences on democracy and human rights defenders. Now I invite Ms. Christina to propose a vote of thanks.
Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Indian Social Institute, Bengaluru, I deem it a great honor to propose vote of thanks on this special occasion of Volken Swamy Memorial Lecture 2022. First of all, I sincerely thank Senior Advocate Brinda Grover for delivering the memorial lecture on democracy and human rights defenders. Thank you, ma'am, for your very insightful and thoughtful provoking address. Your life and vision is a ray of hope for many human rights defenders in India. We remain grateful for all your presence with us today, ma'am. I would like to express my profound gratitude to Chairperson, Senior Advocate Henry Tiffan, for chairing and moderating the lecture. Sir, you have been journeying with the Institute in the struggle for justice for Father Swamy. Thank you, sir, for your constant and continued support. I thank our beloved Director, Dr. Joseph Xavier, for his endless support and guidance. Thank you, Father, for making this event a success. I express my sincere thanks to Father Joy James, the Vice President of Governing Board of Indian Social Institute. Thank you, Father. I also thank Archbishop Peter Machado for his valuable presence with us today. My sincere appreciation to all the Jesuits, the staff members of ISI and college students interning with us who have made the Volken Swamy Memorial Lecture a remarkable one. Thank you for taking forward the legacy of these two fathers, Father Volken and Father Swamy. I thank the media friends for covering this event. I express my profound gratitude to CSO partners and friends, advocates, teachers and students from different educational institutions, Jesuits, priests and religious, and all the well-wishers for your esteemed presence. You have been working with us, encouraging and supporting in all our ventures. Thank you for your cordial presence. Once again, thank you all and have a wonderful evening.
I'm sorry, I'm using the chairperson's position just to make a correction so that both Rita and I are not targeted anywhere. Both of us are advocates, we are not senior advocates. We might, she said she's old, I didn't say that, but we are only advocates, we are not senior advocates. And that is what needs to be recorded because that is technically a problem that is happening. The whole business is well between us.
Thank you, everyone. Have a pleasant evening. As we move on in life, let us carry the spirit of the song played out. Hum honge kamyab.